Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. I know that there was a really weird smell at Ackerman that you might still have whiffs of to an extent. So apparently the pipes in the basement were causing smells to happen in the building. And so it sounds like they resolved it and they're airing out the buildings. That's why all the doors are open on either side. I got that email at like 8 in the morning when I first got into the office. And like, oh, it's a Monday. So should be just about gone. A weird start to the week, but here we are. So welcome back. Glad to have you here. We are moving on into the third week of the class. So as a quick recap, we went over some of the ways that things like assemblies and marches, such as a lot of the labor marches, are able to communicate by using the physical march and act of moving, whether it's moving hundreds of miles to communicate about labor rights in California, right, or marching to strike for conditions of railroad workers. There is a whole history, right, of how social change is using assemblies and marches, and also the role of narrative storytelling. We were looking at the example of Occupy Homes Minnesota, and the way that using personal stories and narratives was able to effectively convince people and frame the issue of homelessness. Not that people are being irresponsible because they can't pay a mortgage, but that banking companies are evil and that they are throwing people out on the streets, right? It's used as a strategy. So we talked a little bit about how the use of a narrative and the use of storytelling helps us to break down and understand social change. So if you're thinking about an example of a social movement or activism that you're interested in for your annotated bibliography or for your writing assignment later on in the term, you might start to think about how they're using story or creating a story about the issue and framing that issue in a really important way. Right, so we're going to be looking at that in a lot more detail today when we look at Black Lives Matter. We look at a lot of cases of individuals such as Trayvon Martin, and we look at how the importance of how populations are framed and treated in a narrative way, how that shapes public understanding of those issues, right? A campaign or form of activism can be on the right side of history, can tell good or compelling points, but if it's not framed in a way that's persuasive or convincing, its impacts tend to be a lot more limited. So we're focusing this week on social media, right, and new media. So new media referring to the explosion of things like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, all of the online and social media outlets that have drastically changed how social change communication is happening and what types of movements and activism we're seeing, right? There are examples of movements that are exclusively online, such as using a specific hashtag or other type of campaign that are happening within that online space. We're continuing to see movements that are happening in a face-to-face or on-the-ground capacity. But I think more and more we're seeing hybrid movements, right, that are circulating and making themselves known through the use of social media, but also might include a face-to-face component. I think there's a lot of really interesting intersections and challenges in understanding how social media is drastically changing the way that we engage in change, right? A lot of the folks that we started to look at in the beginning, such as Aristotle, right, did not exist at a time where social media created these new opportunities for communication. So I think that this adds to and complicates what we know about social change so far. So just as a note for this week, there is no Canvas prompt that you need to turn in this week because this week is the annotated bibliography that I'm asking you to complete on Friday, right? So that'll stand in for the Canvas prompt. Remember that there are a total of 8 Canvas prompts and you can choose 6 of those 8. All of the first Canvas prompts have grades and feedback from me. I will be returning grades and feedback on the second Canvas prompts for those of you who return those in by the end of this week. Your attendance records should also be current through Canvas. So, you know, as you're tracking in the course, that should have all the information that you need there. Just as a reminder, if you go to week number 3, right, you can click right here to access the information about the annotated bibliography. So I'm asking you to pick topic and social movement or a specific social movement that you're interested in and include at least 5 scholarly sources. 3 of those should be outside of our class readings. You might choose 2 that you're interested in this class, or maybe none of them are a good fit for you. You could choose more than 3 outside of the class. This is kind of the grading breakdown that I went over last week, just looking at the citations, annotations, quality of articles, and some of the ways that you can organize and present this. And then again, on the front page of Canvas, I have an example annotation that includes the full APA citation, and then a paragraph that's explaining the key ideas and insights from that. Again, the topic you choose could be the one that connects to your essay later in the class, or you could decide to go in a different direction. So do not feel the pressure to be tied to a topic that you have to continue working on if you're interested in doing something else. Any questions about anything we talked about last class? Anything in general at this point as we head into the third week? Okay. I know this is the week when things are really picking up a bit more, but I also know many of you have been through that before. So if you have any questions or anything I can do to help, just let me know. So what I'd like you to do is take some time on your own to help with the brainstorming process for this annotated bibliography, right? So it's coming up on Friday. What I want you to think about is what might be some of the topics that you're interested in and want to explore a bit for this annotated bibliography. So you might be coming into today's class saying, you know what, I know exactly what I want to write about. I know what I want to talk about. Maybe I've even started outlining, right? Some of you might be thinking, I'm not sure yet. I still need to field some ideas. So either way, I want you to take some time to think about some ideas that you're interested in exploring, right? So it could be a topic in social change. For instance, how we use Instagram to advocate for social change. Maybe that's something you're interested in as a topic. Or maybe you're interested in the role of ethos in social change, right? That'd be an example of a topic. Or you can choose a specific social movement that you're really interested in. So maybe it's one that we've gone over in class. Maybe you're really interested in exploring things such as environmental justice, missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? And similar topics. Or maybe there's a movement that came up in one of our class discussions, like maybe one of the historical labor movements that you found yourself really interested in and wanting to look at more. So take some time to think about some topics that you're interested in doing for this annotated bibliography, non-binding. And then second, do you have questions about this assignment? Are there things that you need for additional support? Take some time to think about if you've got questions or things you want to run by the class. And then if you have a device with you, like a phone or a laptop, I want you to think about an example and try to find maybe an outside source that you could incorporate into your annotated bibliography, such as a scholarly article or book chapter that might be relevant to your topic. And I encourage you to take a bit of time to bookmark or save the link to that article so that you can come back. do about 5 more minutes. Here back. Okay. Anybody who would like some more time in brainstorming some of these ideas? Okay. So what I'd like to do now is to hear some of the ideas that you're thinking about at this point. Have you share some of these ideas with us so that we can get a sense of what you're thinking about, along with any questions that you might have at this point, or things that you might need for additional support. So let's start over here in the side. Nate.
So for my idea, the topic that I had in mind for social movement is called the Panda Protest.
Oh,
This
okay.
took place at I think the University of California. The Berkeley students didn't want being established near them because they wanted to focus on like having healthier foods for the community and students.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think looking at examples like that can be really specialized to a region or like community can be really great, right? Because you get to have a really good search. There's a lot of ways you can incorporate ideas from the class, right? So you might be thinking about examples of sort of like health and food related articles. So there might be like food justice or like promotions of health through social movements. You might also be looking at sustainability and that type of area too. But it gives you a really good starting point. And I'm curious to see it. Angela?
So I decided to focus on climate change for my social movement, but focusing on like how the younger generation is pushing this movement and like how young activists are supporting it and the ways that they are communicating about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know some of you in the class have mentioned folks like Greta Thunberg, right? And like this sort of new generation activism. I think it's been interesting, right, to follow social movements and change that have been so generational and have had such changes in strategy, tactics, communication across that. So there's a wealth to draw from in terms of environmental advocacy, environmental communication. If you haven't talked over in English and writing, there are a couple of folks that do work in that area too, including somebody's name that I'm blanking on. I'll get back to you. But yeah, there's a lot to draw from there. Yeah. Okay.
So I want to focus on LGBT rights,
Uh-huh.
specifically the Don't Say Gay bill,
Oh yeah.
and how both sides promote their ideals,
Mhm.
ideologies, how that's different, because both sides promote it very differently.
Yes. Yes. I think like, again, it's one of those cases where you have a movement that's been going on for a while, right? We go all the way back to Stonewall. We think about it in terms of, Obergefell and Hodges, but you think about like more recent legislation and you get these flashpoints and updates that are happening in the context of history, right? So a lot of you who are looking at sort of updates and movements that have evolved or changed from the past, right? I think drawing from articles that talk about the history or past of that movement is a really great way to link it well to the present. So that's exciting. Kayla?
I am doing the Taliban, the history of that. And
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it was movement, but there's really
Mhm.
but I think there's also some progression that can come off of it, and some of the things like getting more women's sports promoted on ESPN and stuff like that, and women's sports kind of often or showing
Right, right. And, the history and context of Title IX is incredibly important. And I think as well, right, there have been efforts in recent years to try to weaken the Title IX protections, as you know, and sort of responses and pushback against that too. So there's a lot in the moment that can definitely be done from as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that work and integration of those ideas.
All right, so I was thinking about doing the social movement first and like a radical environmental
Mhm.
group. Interesting to me.
Yeah. So Earth First. So a lot of these authors or a lot of these activists and groups, right, especially in environmental change and communication, have really had this focus on visual and very striking strategies, right? Lying down in front of bulldozers, or groups like Greenpeace who have, like hung themselves from bungee cords to stay on the redwoods to keep them being torn down, right? Like there's so much interesting stuff there in terms of the tactics and strategies. One person that is really cool to look at is Kevin DeLuca, DeLuca, who does a lot of work on environmental communication and the rhetoric of environmental communication. I was trying to remember. So folks who are interested in environmental communication, environmental rhetoric, if you have taken a class with, you might know her already or not, definitely recommend reaching out to her, is Dr. Corey Brewster here at EOU, who does a lot of really awesome work in rhetoric and environmental communication. So really great person to contact if you're looking for additional sources and things like that. Yeah, so let's move over here to this side, starting over here.
I'm not really sure what I'm gonna be doing on. I've been kind of looking, but I'm kind of interested in the civil rights movement or doing like Black Lives Matter.
Mhm. Yeah.
Not really sure yet.
Sure. So we're going to continue to explore some of the elements of movement like Black Lives Matter today. Right? And I think one of the ways to think about it is there a flashpoint or moment that's really interesting to you? Because there's the sort of starting history with Trayvon Martin, right? But we have a lot more of its contemporaries and Floyd, right? So if you're finding yourself interested in something and struggling to narrow it down, you might think, what is the moment or the point in this movement is really interesting to you, or a development in this movement is really standing out? And I'm happy to chat if you want to brainstorm a bit more.
I'm gonna do the civil rights movement and like more in specific, like just around like Martin Luther King.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to draw from there, and I think there's a lot of contested discussion about how we talk about history. There has been very whitewashed history of that and a lot of other significant issues and moments in history. Yeah. We'll move over here.
I'm thinking about doing like pro-choice.
Mhm. Yeah, so, there is a lot to draw from and research to do something like body rhetoric, right? Kind of like we've talked about the idea that not only are people marching signs, but people are oftentimes using their body, right, to visually represent and focus on the movement, right? People say hands off my body, or they have very evocative visual imagery that is part of the argument and part of like being there and advocating on those things. So I think that that's a important development to look at in the movement as well. Let's move over here.
I was thinking about doing like the women's rights movement, but specifically for equal pay for
Mhm.
women's sports.
Yeah. Again, thinking about the sort of intersection of women's rights and athletics, Title IX, and similar topics, right? Like there's a lot to draw from there, whether you're looking at sort of sports and social change or thinking about gender and both of those together. There's definitely a wealth of things to draw from. I mean, knowing that there's some interest in athletics, Title IX, and other issues in sports, I'm interested in looking a bit more about that topic because not an area that I'm as familiar with, but definitely a really important.
I'm not entirely sure that currently the
Yeah, right. So, thinking about the history of immigration rights, discussion about immigration, there's a lot you can definitely draw from there. Even like the language of DREAM and using that acronym to discuss and frame dreamers and the way that immigrants have oftentimes been framed or narrativized in this country, right, is a very useful thing to unpack and to explore. So definitely a lot there. Lena?
I've been kind of debating between two, because I do my LGBTQ rights, like marriage equality,
Mhm.
or doing my women's healthcare in regards to psychofunction.
Yeah. Either of those can definitely be really fruitful and important. I mean, one way you could think about it is both, right? Or how we situate things like abortion and healthcare rights in the context of LGBTQ issues, because I think a lot of times, like in thinking about abortion and healthcare rights for like trans or non-binary folks, right? There's a lot of challenges in articulating those rights within a movement. Oftentimes when like language is very gendered about women's right to abortion, when, it's not always women who are seeking abortion. Right? So I think it's, there's a lot to draw from in either of those areas as well as in intersections.
A few of the topics I'm interested in are anything regarding like any like Latinos or Hispanics.
Mhm.
One of them I was looking at is the Chicano movement, but
Mhm.
I also want to look into one that it hasn't really been known yet, but it's like advocating for like higher pay for the field workers that migrate here
Oh,
in
yeah.
the summer. So,
Yeah, and a lot of that kind of history of labor rights and exploitation of labor rights that we're starting to hit on last week, something you could draw from a little bit now as well. So really exciting. Yeah, back here.
I'm not sure yet, but I'm leaning towards the Save the Forest movement.
Yeah. So again, a lot of these environmental movements are framing it both in terms of like intrinsically in saving the environment is a good thing, but also like, oxygen and supply of medicine and other things are like part of the strategy too, and another sort of argument for that. So it's really interesting and great to hear some of the ideas you all are looking at. There's some really good variation. And if you're still thinking about your ideas or your ideas change from what you said today to what you end up working on, that's okay, right? There's the space to do that. I think that being able to focus on a time or moment or situation within a movement that you're interested in and can focus on is great. I think finding topically similar things like environmental related movements or strategies that a movement does that are similar to other things. For instance, the use of body rhetoric or physicality in the context of abortion or healthcare rights, right? Those things are definitely good things to link to your project. So some general tips, right, and things to think about as you work on this annotated bibliography. That Purdue OWL is a really good resource. Those of you who've had classes with me before, we've gone over that quite a bit, but it is a really great way for you to kind of know how to cite in APA, MLA, or Chicago, right? It's got that whole style guide that lists out some of the ways to cite in any one of those three formats. Again, the Writing Center and library are really great, especially if you're interested in the topic and want to pursue some additional work or resources, or using something like interlibrary loan is a really great resource so that you can reach out about an article that you're interested in, but like you can only read the first page or you can only read part of it because it's locked behind a paywall. I would absolutely not recommend and not ask you to use Sci-Hub, which posts articles illegally for people to access and download for free. Don't do that. Whatever you do, do not use Sci-Hub. Also, another thing you could do is reach out to authors, right? So this is wild, but if there's an article by an author that you're interested in, right, and you can't access the article because it's not provided through EOU, you could send the author an email, right, or ask them for a copy of the text. There are some websites like ResearchGate where you can do that. And I will tell you, because I've gotten a few requests, it's always very sweet and flattering to get a request for somebody to see your paper, right? So a lot of times people will absolutely say yes if you're asking them for a copy. But if you're hitting a wall, the well is running dry and you need additional support, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to help you with finding some possible sources that work really well for what you're looking for. One thing that you can do as well that might be a kind of like a self milestone as you're thinking about preparing for this is if you want to send me like an annotation example, like you complete one of your 5 and you just want to send me the one to see if it's on the right track. I'm happy to give it a look. My guaranteed return if you send it to me is if you send it by the end of the day on Wednesday. I will try if you send it later, but I can't guarantee. You don't need to send me a draft, for example, but it might be useful. Again, this is not a big essay or writing project or opinion piece. It's just kind of your opportunity to look at topics that you're interested in and that jump out to you. The goal is to learn a little bit more and to connect what you're noticing with previous work that is talked about and looked into some of those issues. Any questions about this activity? Okay. So this week, in looking at new media and social media, you might have a couple articles that you use for the annotated bibliography that come from these chapters or come from this piece. By the way, if you're looking at your 5, you can use an individual chapter and each chapter counts as one. So you could include 2 quick chapters and then you would need 3 sources outside. So these 2 quick chapters, one is about social movements, media, and discourse in the context of Black Lives Matter, particularly in the context of how the Black Lives Matter movement started, and a lot of the communication that was used in the very beginning to frame the issue. The second one that we'll be getting at a bit more on Wednesday is about fan-based social movements. This is kind of an interesting one. I wasn't familiar with the Harry Potter Alliance, but apparently there's a population who has used sort of the book and film franchise and the narratives of that franchise as a way of advocating for social change, and sort of used like metaphors such as Dumbledore's army to describe and articulate social change on a variety of issues, right? And there's obviously a lot of challenges with using that media and using Harry Potter, especially given the background of J.K. Rowling, right? So I don't know how that movement is negotiated entirely, but a lot of movements, right, might be using things like a fan base or some type of shared meaning toward change. So while we'll be looking at a case study of a fan-based social movement, I think the broader takeaway from this reading this week is the idea that a movement draws from a shared sense of meaning and community and a shared sort of set of artifacts and understanding that allows that movement to create change, right? If Dumbledore's army is framed as resistance against an authoritarian or fascist regime, right? That sense of understanding is used as part of the movement's argument. Dr. Tony Anderson, who is one of our professors here at EOU, actually does a lot of really cool research and background in online cultures and fan communities. That's like her whole area of focus. So she's definitely somebody to talk to if you're interested in that. And then there's a piece that I wrote that we'll be looking at as well, that was looking at the Crypt the Vote campaign that was designed to promote accessibility in voting places. I always feel a little bit weird about like assigning articles that I wrote, but I do think that it's something that we can bring into our discussion about social movements and their use of social media. At worst, it's an opportunity to learn a little bit about some of the areas that I focus on in terms of research and can speak to a little bit that hopefully will be of use. That's kind of what we'll be looking at for this week. So we'll be mostly focusing on that chapter 10 for today. So what we'll be thinking about this week and sort of the broader question that I want us to explore a little bit is this idea that social media and new media, again, outlets like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, et cetera, right, have presented incredible opportunities for people to advocate, to mobilize, to communicate about social change. And we can think about what those benefits really look like. What can they do that's positive? But I also want you to think about what some of the challenges or limitations might be to communicating social change on social media, right? And lastly, to think about what makes effective persuasion. What is a persuasive message that's communicated using social media? So I'd like you to take some time in partnership or group of three to chat a little bit about these questions. What do you all think are some of the advantages, drawbacks, and ways that persuasion can be used in these? And once you've had some time to chat a little bit about this, I'll put this together in a document where we can share some of our thoughts. Let's take about 10 minutes or so to work through this.
I should go to or Instagram reel. like engaging. And normal, sure. But still doesn't- Tiger pierces the body. Like, oh,
Okay. Any groups who'd like some more time or? Sure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we see as some of the advantages and drawbacks to using social media for social. Let's start with advantages. What are some of the things that social media does really well? Social change. Any groups who want to share things that came up? Yeah.
Social media is used as like an educational tool for communicating information about social.
Yeah, right. So it's educational, right? In fact, a lot of campaigns might say, educate yourself about this, right? There's resources that can be provided to be able to understand and engage on issues, for an understanding of things like structural racism through a movement advocacy. Sure. Yeah.
It also reaches like a wide variety of people.
Right, so you get a much bigger audience, or the potential for a much bigger audience, right? Because it can circulate, be available just about anywhere. Yeah.
Reach people at like any time. You don't have to wait.
Yeah, right. Once you put something on the internet, it never really goes away, right? You try to delete something and somebody has already screen capped it by that point. But the advantage is that you're able to, regardless of time of day, context, you're able to have that information there. You can refer back to that, right? You can look through tweets, you can look through history of something in a way that's saved online in a pretty unique way. What are other things that online communication gives us? Yeah, Kate.
More entertaining.
Yeah.
Just like reading a 20-page article. And also get the relatively decent amount of information across
Yeah,
a small.
right? So oftentimes, because you have multimedia, you have the use of audio, the use of video, the use of images, right? The circulation of those things through stuff like memes. I see a lot of memes that are like related to social change, or like a meme template that starts with like, it starts like a very traditional meme that like almost like gets you or lures you into a different topic. One that I saw was somebody who was posting about their favorite Pokemon starter. It's like, some say it's Charizard, some say it's Charmander, some say it's Squirtle, but we need to investigate and interrogate this act of violence or something like that, right? There's a kind of culture jamming or subversive way that media is being used, right? Right, looking at discourse through things like TikTok, there's been a whole meme that's been going around where people are posting like what they would do if they asked somebody they hated to, or they took somebody they hated on a tour of Portland, right? And people were saying, oh, we'll go here, we'll go here, we'll go here. And there was somebody who was pushing back against that and saying, well, a lot of you all who are saying this are like saying that the places you hate are places where there are higher like populations of people of color and there are higher rates of homelessness, and like critiquing sort of the language that was being used there, right? So there's interesting ways that social media can sort of critique or respond or create new information, right? Anything else here in terms of advantages? Yeah.
I want to get people out faster.
Yes. Right, speed. If we think about George Floyd, right, that footage got circulated and spread at a very, very fast rate, right? You see things live, and the ability to get information that quickly really helps to shape the movement, right? We're not using carrier pigeon to communicate about something. Anything else here? Yeah, Jenna?
Like kind of feels like financial support. Create a platform for that.
Yeah,
And I also think too that it should be like super inclusive, like everybody there's such space on it, but like, you know, they're like I don't know, people with disabilities, like that are going to death, you can find like different social media outlets.
right. So, you know, financial support and aid, people use like resources and things like GoFundMe, other ways to seek out aid and seek out support, right? That kind of direct aid or action. We also saw, especially in the context of COVID-19, focus on mutual aid, right? A lot of those kinds of networks for support. Inclusivity and accessibility, right? That's something that is a really big advantage too. One thing that I look at, for instance, I was looking at Disability March, which was sort of this march for people who couldn't attend a march face-to-face to participate virtually. And one thing people were saying was like, you know, I wanted to go march, but I have a service animal and the street will not allow my service animal to be there. Or there's steps, I can't climb up the steps, right? So accessibility can be a really big benefit there. What about some of the drawbacks or limitations of using social media for social change? Lynn?
We kind of talked about how false information.
Yeah, right. So definitely seen that, right? We've even seen like Onion articles that, of course, are satirical, but people take them seriously sometimes, right? So the ability to critically think and parse out and identify credible information can be a lot more difficult, right? Especially when the algorithms and targeting of that information tends to be towards specific groups, including groups who might skew a bit more older and be more likely to be susceptible to that information. What else? Yeah, think about
Social media can also negatively influence the general public.
yeah. Right. So we see this a lot where people, especially when it comes to like something like an election season or time of phase, right, are really tired of an issue, right, or don't want attention or time spent on news that might be really negative, right? So oftentimes it leads. A lot of news outlets will frame disproportionately negative stories. That can be, you know, negative influence that can have for sure. What are other things that are some potential drawbacks?
Bias is basically can be created.
I know a lot of social media is like filter out based on like what you are looking for.
Mhm.
And so if you can get into those space, they're just kind of they're just instead of going help you.
Yeah. Right. So, you know, there's, I think, a lot of bubbles that can come up in terms of, you know, who you're friends with, who you follow, et cetera, right? That's filtering your feed. But, right, we also have algorithms and targeted advertising where the information we're getting is very much filtered on that basis too, including a lot of social media sites like Facebook. Actually, if you go to the settings, they'll display information about where they think you fit and where they're targeting you with advertisements based on things that they think they know about your demographic information. Right? So that can be a challenge, right? And also, when you think about news framing and news priming, right? You go to Fox News and Newsmax, or you go over to MSNBC or Huffington Post, you're going to see very different sets of headlines a lot of the time. Or at the very least, if you're seeing similar topics covered, the way that they're covered and talked about is going to look really different, right? So priming and framing play a really big role there. Any other kind of potential drawbacks that we might see? Yeah.
People like hearing about something happening too much that you feel something like that.
Right. Right. So this is a concern that comes up too. Glad you bring that up. While social media can do very intentional and positive change, right? There is change that very much fits in that. There's also change that, or efforts at change that aren't really doing anything good and are based more on that individual who is trying to, as you say, gain social capital over circulating or posting or sharing, right? So being able to parse and identify where one starts and the other begins, that can be a little challenging. Performative activism could be a large corporation that does literally nothing except give themselves like a rainbow color for Pride Month, right? So that might fit into that too. Any other strengths or weaknesses that are missing here? Yeah.
We also talk about how get a lot of threats and stuff from people on social media. And you can also even get banned by the platform itself.
Right. So this question of bans, suspension, censorship, like those issues, terms of service and guidelines, right? There's sort of filters and how that information is being circulated. Also, right, the unique opportunity for targeting. I think about like the Star Wars fan base and some of the backlash against some of the characters and actors, right? There were people who quit social media because they were being like bullied by fans, right? Because that can really contribute to some of the challenges that social media can bring, right? The practice of doxing or publicly releasing personal information, address, and all of that about people on social media. That stuff gets really scary, right? So that can be a really major danger. So what makes social media persuasive, right? Like what makes the messages that we receive on social media work? There's some thoughts here.
Can be used to like create videos
Yeah,
and is it eco?
Yeah.
Can you use ways of adding background music to like make it better?
yeah. So whenever I'm doing a road trip, right, I won't watch a YouTube video, but I'll do the audio only thing. I like to like listen to video essays about video games and music and movies and all those things, right? So oftentimes, right, there's a persuasive argument that's framed through a video, through podcast, audio, right? It's making an argument and framing that argument in a unique way through the editing, the structure, the style, right? All of those things I think can play a really big role here. I like to use some ethos here, drawing from credibility. I was there, I was at this thing, here's a recording of me at this event, right? The presence of things like body cams, right? Of course, can really provide that visual information. What else? Yeah, Kiana?
Like creating controversy. And think it's something controversial and very like people.
Yeah,
It's gonna get shared.
right? Like hot take, right? That can be expressing a controversial opinion that gets people's attention can be a really powerful communication strategy. So, you know, that can also be a way to kind of poke out of the quantity of information and noise that we get online. In fact, studies have shown that the use of sound bites by politicians have gotten smaller and smaller, right? The snippet of content that circulates online is less and less and less. So we see the use of hashtags and much shorter language to describe movements a lot more. It tends to cut through and be more persuasive. Anything else that we think contributes to effective persuasion? Yeah. Like,
You had one about it earlier, but just kind of using tools to target specific demographics
Mhm.
and being able to target people is a way of persuasion because
Yeah.
you're always showing people what they want to see.
right? And that can save a lot of money and resources. Like if you are a candidate for governor, right, and you're not going to want to reach people that you know no matter what are never going to vote for you. You're going to try to target people who might be moderate or on the fence or unsure or might not vote, right? So it saves a lot of money and time, and it helps make your advertisements a lot more specific for sure. Any other things that contribute to the persuasiveness of social media? So one other thing that I might add here is the use of personal examples and stories, right? I think one thing that social media really helps to enable are people telling their own experiences with something, right? So, you know, you're on social media and somebody is talking about what Indigenous Peoples Day might mean to them, right? Growing up in an Indigenous background. Right? So that use of examples, narrative, and storytelling to connect people, I think can be a really powerful strategy too, that's enabled through the ability of people to connect. So I think this is a really good working list of some of the ways that social media brings a lot to the table, but I think also brings in some challenges, right, in terms of how we're able to communicate and engage effectively. So why don't we take a short break and we'll kind of resume this discussion here to get more into the nitty-gritty of this quick reading. So take some time, grab some water, grab a drink, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that this week's reading connects to some of the ideas that you all brought up. So I've gone ahead and posted that brainstorming document that we were working on just now to the front page of Canvas, in case you're ever interested in looking back through it and thinking about that a bit more. So I really appreciated your observations and ideas here about social media and communication, right? This is, of course, a really important issue. Again, one of the challenges is this idea of performative activism. A lot of companies will go rainbow for Pride Month. That's not necessarily that doing so is a bad thing, right? I think the critique and pushback has come in when some of these groups are not doing anything else, or when some of these groups are supporting a cause, but are actively doing practices that go against that cause, right? So you say you have a rainbow, you're supporting Pride, but you were donating and supporting causes that might go against those rights. So, there's, I think, discussion about some of those elements as well. Accessibility, right, that was brought up, creating those opportunities online that you don't necessarily have everybody able to access face-to-face. Connections across networks and, across large distances. We became known about things like the Arab Spring because of the circulation of social media and the ripple effect that had, right? Targeted algorithms, communication online. And then this challenge of noise, right? So every day when you wake up and check social media, whatever accounts you have, if any, right? You're going to get a lot of material. You're going to get a lot of content. You're going to get grandma posting minions, right? There's so much online that happens every day that it's very hard for us to sort of parse out the important parts, right? We're getting a lot of noise and advertisements, material. So how does effective communication poke through that, right? And communicate something to us that we remember. When oftentimes we find ourselves exhausted by the quantity of things that we get online. So I think a couple concepts can really help us to think about this, think about social media in a bit more detail. Another benefit to social media that really closely connects to chapter 10 of CRIC is the idea that social media is able to push back against or resist or even correct dominant media narratives about things, right? So media might be talking about or framing an issue in a particular way. You get people on social media who say, hang on, right? That's now not how this should be talked about, or that's not how this happened when I was there, right? In many ways, right, we've seen criticism of media's coverage and journalism. It's a challenging tightrope for people who are involved and interested in that area because, right, you have the organizational demands that journalists have, also potential for bias, potential for misinformation and misreporting, right? Oftentimes, people find themselves frustrated with how media is talking about a story. Social media provides an opportunity to issue a corrective of that. So two issues that I think are useful in thinking about in media are these ideas of both priming and framing that are two different areas. Dr. Jiawei Chen teaches a lot of courses in media ethics and mass media. So he's definitely somebody to reach out to if you're interested in understanding more about these topics. But media priming refers to the ways in which we use imagery and headlines to emphasize certain issues and get people thinking about something, right? So one example, right, is that in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of media coverage surrounding COVID-19, right? You check the news, you view a headline in like May 2020, in the dark ages, right? And you'll see that COVID-19 is probably in the headlines and being talked about very extensively. What have we noticed, right? We've noticed that over time, COVID-19 has gotten much less attention and discussion as case rates have gone down, right? However, other topics, right, and other issues, for example, inflation in the United States have gained a lot more attention and a lot more traction, right? Media priming is essentially telling us which stories or headlines we should view as the most important and the topics that we should be caring more about relative to other topics, right? So that's not necessarily, that's not saying that media is all powerful in its ability to tell us what to think about, right? It doesn't have hypnosis, but what it is saying is that on average, we're more likely to pay attention to or focus on stories that are at the top of the agenda through media priming. A good example of how social media might push back against this, right, was the case of Breonna Taylor, right, who was killed and didn't receive the degree of media attention and response that many activists and advocates deemed was necessary for that issue. So a lot of social media was pushing back and emphasizing her importance and the importance of her story being remembered and told in a way that went against media priming. So media priming is what we should think about, what we were told to think about that's more important, while media framing is talking about the particular stories themselves. So how do we frame, right, or portray an issue or topic? So a good example of this is in COVID-19, right? Are we in a pandemic, or have we moved on and are we no longer in a pandemic? There's been a lot of discussion about moving toward being in an endemic, right, where it exists, but it's been a lot less cases overall. So how we frame or talk about COVID-19 as either pandemic or endemic would be an example of media framing, right? Think about it like a picture frame, right? What is and is not in the frame, and emphasize domination. In the same way, there's a lot of pushback against media framing. Depending on how a news article is talking, for instance, about a case of a person of color who is killed by a police officer, right? Your framing can run anywhere from, innocent bystander who's brutally murdered and killed, all the way to, very racially charged language to describe somebody who, is a looter or a thug, right? That use of language that has a very specific racial connotation is oftentimes used as part of media framing to elicit a particular response, right? So these things are important when we think about the power of social media to sort of respond to media's discussion about these issues. So if we think back about a decade ago to 2012, right, we can think about the case of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin that was actually the sort of inspiration behind the start of Black Lives Matter, right? So I know that this is probably a story many of you are familiar with, but I wanted to show a short video that provides some additional context here and also talks a little bit about the elements that kind of gave rise to Black Lives Matter as a hashtag and as a movement in responding to some of these challenges.
What started as a hashtag in 2013 went from trending on social media to becoming one of the largest movements in American history. Black Lives Matter started with a Facebook post by one of its founders, Alicia Garza. Her post, entitled "A Love Letter to Black People," was a dedication to the Black community after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. She ended with the words, "Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter." Garza and her friends Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi coined the hashtag Black Lives Matter later that year. As the hashtag's popularity grew, so did backlash with the rise of white lives and all lives matter groups. The number of Black victims of police brutality also grew, making the slogan increasingly important. In 2014, the deaths of Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown ignited the movement and protests nationwide. But it was the death of Michelle Clouseau that same year that began Save Her Name, a subsection of the Black Lives Matter movement that focuses on Black women who have lost their lives to police violence. It quickly rose in popularity and was used in protests for the deaths of Sandra Bland and then Breonna Taylor. In 2019, places where BLM protests occurred had a 20% decrease in killings by police. Local protests also increased the amount of police body cams and community policing initiatives. In 2020, as many as 26 million people participated in demonstrations protesting the killing of George Floyd.
So, right, I think the origin of that movement, that post in 2013, is not something that is as well known or discussed. And I also think that a lot of the sort of way that the movement and use of that hashtag kind of had that re-ignition in the case of George Floyd, right, is a sort of highlight of how movements can change, ebb and flow. It wasn't not there, right, in that period of time, but that its significance and attention really kind of grew at that time. So this article is really focusing on the sort of start of the usage of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, its circulation and its impact. So essentially, as we've been talking about, social media and much of its power and influence is in its ability to go outside of what we might see as a dominant media frame in order to describe and talk about some of these issues, right? One of the ways that it does this, as you all mentioned, is the persuasiveness of visual media, the ability to have videos, ethos, credibility, and background, right? People can oftentimes make more independent judgments and opinions based on the resources and evidence themselves, rather than purely getting a version of it that is filtered or circulated via them. So an example here of a tweet, unless politicians are saying arrest the other 3 cops, arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor, words are less useless, right? Saying essentially politicians, media leaders, and so on are not focusing on or paying attention to this issue, right? So they push back against what is and is not being talked about, why certain things are or are not being talked about, are a way that social media can continue to be involved. Again, there are still problems, right? It's not a catch-all solution. There's a lot of topics and issues that I don't know that that still are not receiving the coverage or attention that they probably should. But there's this idea that social media is creating an opportunity to push back against the issues that are being discussed. So this chapter 10 gets into the analysis of the usage of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, as well as how specific BLM chapters were utilizing this hashtag and utilizing social media for activism. So the 3 that we're focused on were in LA, Chicago, and Minneapolis. And they also employ, so in some parts of a lot of articles like these, you're going to see method sections that go over some of the ways that they did this study, right? So they do this idea of critical discourse studies where they're looking through tweets and social media and trying to categorize and understand how social media is talking about and using these issues. Their argument is this idea that the usage of social media is able to promote the idea of self-representation. So social media is powerful in part because it's an opportunity to bring your voice in, to let your voice be heard and to speak out about a thing where you might not otherwise have a voice or have a platform to express your perspective on it, right? So, you know, the bad side of that is the comment section of the internet. The good side of that is saying an issue that I'm passionate about or I'm personally related to is something that I can now share in a way that maybe I couldn't before. Counter-hegemonic function, right? So hegemony is very much focused on this notion of power and control and influence and domination. So to counter that is to provide a narrative or way of thinking about an issue that goes against that dominant reading. So here on the right is Jürgen Habermas, and Habermas is somewhat famous for this notion of the public sphere, right? So you've taken a class in rhetoric or communication, there's a good chance that you have heard a little bit about the idea of the public sphere. His theory is that if we create this space or public sphere in which people can communicate, it's this open dialogue where people can disagree, people can argue, people can advocate on things. And it almost goes back to this really Greek idea that people advocate about and hash out their differences, the truth will emerge, which I don't know that we see necessarily now in the same way, but the idea here being that democratic engagement, action, and discussion, whether or not it leads to a quote capital T truth, is a good thing that we can be able to do. So I wanted to share a little bit here about this approach, right, and this idea of communicative
Let's
action.
talk about communication. As planners, communication is central to our work. We need to communicate with the public, with the government, and with other planners. But how should we communicate? Let's first look at how we're able to communicate in the first place. Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action states that to understand each other, both sides of any communication must have certain mutual understanding. The most basic example of a mutual understanding is language. If 2 people don't physically speak the same language, they're going to have trouble communicating. Likewise, vocabulary, word choice, and colloquialism must be understood by both parties. Both sides of any communicative action must also understand the meaning of the communication, and the communication must be understood to be valid. So let's bring Habermas's theory of communicative action back to the planning profession.
So that's an example in kind of an applied context, right? But communicative action, right, suggests that in order for us to be able to talk about an issue or persuade each other, we have to have some sense of shared meaning, right? We have to understand language, we have to understand what that language is saying, but we also need to have this idea of validity, that the communication that is happening between sides, that people are expressing it with their own agency and that they're doing so in a way that's accurate, right? So essentially what this study is doing is testing how Black Lives Matter is communicating in a valid way and conveying information that is accurate, that is agentic from the participants in that movement and so forth, right? So communicative action says we've got to be on the same page. We have to understand what it is that we're talking about, right? If we're talking about COVID-19 and information and sources that are being used on that topic are incredibly different, and might or might not be factually based, then that would be an issue of validity in communicative action. Subject, right, refers to the concept or idea that is standing in for or being talked about in the larger issue. So in this case, using a discussion about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman is part of a larger discussion about Black Lives Matter, about racial justice and similar types of issues. And then source, right? Cite your sources, where's your source? That gets used a lot, right? To talk about how that media is originating. So for instance, if a video is circulating, maybe that's coming from body cam and maybe it was uploaded to YouTube. So the way that it source is conveying information, such as a tweet, would be an example of how sources shaping communication. So one example of this is there was the usage of the term Black Christmas on a very regular basis to describe the organizational efforts of Black Lives Matter protesters in the context of that movement. So communicative action helps us establish a sense of what makes the movement work in creating a shared understanding. So what this article breaks down then is if we look at Black Lives Matter, we look at the movement, particularly in the time following George Zimmerman's acquittal, right? What came up? What were the actions and strategies that tended to emerge as the most common prevalent? And I think that looking at these strategies of social media are things that really closely connect to a lot of the examples that you all brought up at the very beginning of class, talking about the social movements you're interested in, what these social movements do, as well as talking about how social movements might use social media effectively. You probably notice a lot of similarities, right? One of them is this idea that the use of hashtags, right, and of symbols, titles, that conveys this idea of shared. It's pretty clear that using a term like Black Lives Matter as a hashtag has a very specific connotation to it, right? Or hashtag justice for Breonna Taylor, right? Or hashtag Me Too. These are examples of how the specific hashtag is standing in for a larger movement. Pretty straightforward. Another thing that I think is useful here is the way that certain phrases are being used in a continual basis through connotative meaning. That is, if we understand that communication breeds shared understanding, what that means is that phrases such as rise or stand up, right, has this unique rhetorical function. That yes, we know that that doesn't mean that we actually want people to physically stand up when they're reading the tweet. That would be silly, right? But this idea of stand up meaning maybe that somebody attends a protest or demonstration or finds another way to participate is sort of how we interpret or read that call. You might even think about the usage of rise or stand up in the context of Black Power, right? And that history of the sort of Black Power salute being used in that way, right? We might even hear the use of language like take a knee, of course, in reference to Colin Kaepernick, right? So the connotative meaning that's being used is something that's drawing upon shared knowledge. Humanizing victims, right? So again, if you think about narratives, you think about storytelling, you think about the power of communication to frame an issue, right? A lot of the ways in which victims are described has been one of the major sources of controversy and debate. is this an innocent bystander who did nothing wrong, who was just walking, who like had a toy, right, and wasn't trying to hurt anybody, or was this somebody that was attacking or doing a physical altercation or dangerous, right? Of course, that has a very racially charged approach as well. So one of the major efforts of this campaign against a lot of media narratives was to reframe victims as innocent or as people that, even if they were involved in a crime, were not involved in the crime that necessitated a violent response, right? So the idea of reframing how victims were discussed prior was a really big goal in how this movement communicated. Strategic imagery, right? Here's a kind of rough example of strategic imagery. So I was talking to a friend who went to a very white high school, and she's talking about how the very few people of color at their high school were always the ones that were being told to pose for her school's brochures, right? This idea that oftentimes schools will try to tokenize people of color and say, look how diverse we are, right? That strategy integrates this idea of strategic imagery. In a kind of flipping of that script, Black Lives Matter was actually incorporating imagery, for instance, of white women present at the protest to identify that there was allyship or collaboration or support from white protesters as well, in order to suggest that there's a strategic element by which people might work together. So in this way, right, it was saying that if this movement is also integrating and including white women, right, that that adds to the effectiveness or persuasion of that movement. Hashtag activism can convey this idea of collective activism. That is, collective activism is being a group of people who are united toward a particular cause or change. So for instance, you might look to how somebody is using the hashtag to similarly advocate for an issue, right? Again, at worst, that goes into performative activism territory. You remember the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, right? People were just doing that challenge without necessarily caring about or identifying the issue or topic and just doing it just because, ranging to people who did it really as part of trying to donate and support. That difference in collective activism can be seen. Again, this idea of framing victims as unfairly killed, this narrative, this storytelling element, I think is really powerful. And when I say story or storytelling, that doesn't mean it's fiction, right? It just means that there's a way that we're interpreting and understanding the events that happen. So a story is a way that we mentally picture and map out an event. As mentioned, right, tweets can respond to and correct media narratives. So rather than so-and-so was a violent person with a drug record, right? It's so-and-so was innocent and unjustly murdered, right? Framing of peaceful protests. So this is something that we have seen a lot in the context of Black Lives Matter in a more contemporary sense, also in terms of a lot of other movements. There's actually a piece from, that is the article that's in the example annotated bibliography, that's about public sphere to public screen, and the idea that oftentimes dominant groups will take a protest or take a demonstration and use in a media framing, they'll portray it as significantly more violent in an effort to get the public against that movement and its cause. Because if it's violent, people are, hurting or killing or destroying each other, then how could you support this? So, while there's reported instances of violence, there's also ways that violence is covered through media that might be very strategic as well. So a lot of movements make a very specific effort to frame things as peaceful or to emphasize the peaceful elements of protest to push back against the narrative that this was violent, right? Again, that's why a lot of activists and leaders who might be in favor of peaceful protest really kind of push back against people who might use violence if that's not a part of their strategy, right? You had a lot of, for instance, Black leaders and organizers who became frustrated with white protesters and told them, no, don't flip the police car, right? So discursive structures also challenge this idea of Black criminality, right? So the broader kind of narrative or frame that is being challenged here, right, was a sort of racist frame that assumed that being Black meant that somebody was a criminal, right? Which is not true. It's not the case, of course, but making that association might be a priming tactic that media uses that this campaign is trying to push back against. Oftentimes, also, there's the use of simple, concise language, also the use of like irony or humor. It was oftentimes based on a belief in a lack of trust in law enforcement that was used as part of this movement. Again, how you feel about this movement, the kind of boundaries of this movement, that's up to you. But I do think that identifying the communication strategies that were used and what was and could be considered to be effective within movements using social media are good things to point out here. If we're thinking back to what we brainstormed about what makes a social media related movement effective, I think we see a lot of similarities there. Effective messaging, usage of ethos, really good imagery, usage of collective activism, motivating people for the cause, right? Using storytelling and framing in an important way. I think all of those elements are really evident in this analysis and discussion. So what I want you to do is to go back to the attendance activity that you worked at the beginning of class. And I want you to think about one of the examples of a social movement that you might incorporate into your annotated bibliography. So maybe it's one of the examples that you shared with us or one that you're looking at or thinking about here. And I want you to take some time to think about how the movement that you chose has been using social media. Then whether or not this movement strategies are similar to or different from some of the strategies that we talked about that were used by Black Lives Matter. And if your social movement doesn't involve the use of social media or is like an older movement, that's okay. You might consider an offshoot or development or sort of spin-off of that movement in a more modern context that might be utilizing social media. So think about how your movement might be using social media and how it's using some of its messaging. So I'll give you some time to explore and think about that in a bit more detail. We got a couple more minutes to do this. Anybody who would like some more time here? How many people felt that the social media strategies you noticed were overall pretty similar? Let's point that out here. Yeah, so I think that there'll be a lot of overlap. If you're looking at a movement like Black Lives Matter, you might think about a specific time or context of this movement you're really interested in exploring. Another way to divide up the topics for this class is to be thinking about maybe it's a part of the movement or a part of the strategy the movement uses. For example, maybe you're looking exclusively about a movement's use of picket signs or the way that they use Twitter, right? I just encourage you to think about that level of focus based on what interests you and what you find would be pretty reasonable to focus on for this class. So again, I encourage you to continue thinking about what you're interested in for your topic. And you're welcome to continue to chat with me about it as you're thinking about this. So I'm gonna give you the chance to get out here a little bit early today, but we took some time to talk about social media, right? The ways in which social media provides some really unique opportunities to engage on social change issues. I really enjoyed your discussion about some of the strengths and weaknesses that we see through social media and the challenges, right? If we're advocating on our own, that can definitely be an important consideration of social media's influence on that process. And also some of the ways that new media has been informed by this changing landscape that we found ourselves in and the switch to a lot more digital outlets, especially in these past 2 or 3 years. As an update, I'm meeting with Rural Oregon Action this week, and I'm hoping that we can get them to present to us sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Just tell us a little bit about what they do, how they use communication for social change. They will just keep you updated about all that good stuff. So please either email or pass forward the attendance activity that you did for today. We'll be talking a bit more about accessibility in online movements, promoting that for social change, questioning what a movement is, if it's focused on embodiment, and who is able to move, and also some of the ways that fan-based social movements or the use of shared meaning can help to develop social change communication too. So definitely get a start on that annotated bibliography if you haven't already done so. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Some of you are probably going to be pretty relieved to be out of Ackerman now. And I'll see you again for Wednesday class.